Thank you. At this time, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce our commencement speaker, Linda Downey, President and Executive Director of the Pine Street Inn, which provides permanent supportive housing, job training and placement, emergency shelter, and street outreach to nearly 2,000 individuals each and every day. Ms. Downey has worked with Pine Street Inn for her entire career, over 35 years, serving in her current role as President and Executive Director since 2000. With a keen understanding of the complex causes of homelessness and proven methods to combat it, Downey continues to successfully involve and build partnerships with social service agencies, state legislators, and business leaders in the fight to end homelessness. The resources the Pine Street Inn provides on a daily basis are staggering. 2,700 meals, 670 emergency beds in 4 shelters across Boston, 850 homeless tenants, and more than 40 permanent housing facilities. As a result of Downey's leadership and vision, Pine Street is now the largest provider of permanent supportive housing for individuals moving out of homelessness in New England. The work of the Pine Street Inn has never been more important than it is today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to invite Linda Downey up to give our keynote address.
Thank you, President Ceballos, and to you, the graduates, for asking me to join you today. You have made it through one of the most challenging years in our lifetime, and I hope you give yourselves a collective pat on the back. If this year has taught us anything, it's that we're all connected, and in the words of Bart Giamatti, former president of Yale University and then baseball commissioner, and a huge Red Sox fan, by the way, assert positively the need we have for the other. That is the real work of humankind. I did wonder, what could I say to you that would be meaningful? Many years ago, I sat in the space you are in today, and I will tell you, my mind was not on the graduation speaker at the University of Vermont, where I went to college, but on how soon I could ditch my parents and see my boyfriend. My parents immigrated from Scotland when I was 7 years old. I did not understand until later the sacrifices they both made, leaving their friends and family to come to a new country, so my brothers and I would have a different set of opportunities they only dreamed of. Then, of course, there is the I had to walk 5 miles to school story. Funny enough, my father did have a 3-mile walk to school story. He was born in Glasgow, Scotland, and during the Second World War, because many of the British Navy ships were built in Glasgow, the Nazis bombed the city in 1941, and as a result, my father, his brothers, and 2 younger cousins were evacuated to a small village called Connell in the northeast of Scotland. They stayed with a cousin of my grandfather's and indeed walked about 3 miles each way to school. There was no running water or electricity, and in the winter they had to break through the ice to get water. I, on the other hand, had a life much easier, and I know I have been given great gifts, but the greatest gift of these has been a quality education. I will point out, however, that during my elementary school years, girls were not allowed to wear pants to school. Finally, someone went to the superintendent, and we were allowed to wear pants under our skirts or dresses, but not pants alone. Our TVs did not have remotes, our phones had cords and were affixed to the wall, and no one had more than 5 channels on the TV. You've grown up in a generation that has seen the most profound progress in technology, artificial intelligence, and our ability to capture and synthesize data. You may well be the smartest, most diverse, and well-informed group in the history of the country. What will you do with this access, this data? And how will you use it to create a better civilization? Because in the end, that is what education is all about. I ended up at Pine Street accidentally. I had moved to Boston from Vermont because my college roommate moved to Boston. Seemed like a good idea at the time. I decided to apply to law school because that too seemed like a good idea at the time. One of my roommates had gone to BC, and one day while I was waiting for her, I picked up an alumni magazine with an obituary about Paul Sullivan, who founded Pine Street Inn. The obituary was written by Paul's good friend, John Whistler, who ran the BC Alumni Association. Paul took over what was a rescue mission in Chinatown soon after he got sober. He understood what it was like to live at the bottom. He had lost his job, his family wanted nothing to do with him, and he twice attempted suicide. I ripped the page out of that magazine, stuck it in my back pocket, and kept it. That obituary changed my life. 3 weeks later, while I was waiting to hear about law school, I saw an ad in the Boston Globe for a 6-month position working at Pine Street Inn. I borrowed a dress from my roommate, grabbed my one pair of heels, and rode my bike to the South End for an interview because I was not sure how to get from Brighton to the South End on the T. I got to Pine Street and sat for nearly 45 minutes in the lobby of the men's shelter. I quickly realized that I was overdressed and learned later that new candidates were left in the lobby. And if you were still there after 45 minutes, you passed the first test. We still do this, by the way. If you can't last 45 minutes and you're uncomfortable, probably not going to work out for you. I got the job, and after 6 months, the woman who hired me, who remains a friend and a mentor to this day, asked me if I wanted to take on another job. Much to my father's disappointment, I said yes, and that I would stay 1 more year and then go on to law school. But by then, I really was smitten with the place, the staff, and most of all, the guests, who, despite all they had been through, were tenacious, gracious, and so very funny. To this day, my favorite time is sitting in the lobby and, as we would say, lending an ear, listening to the stories of loss, of hope, of love. When I took this job as executive director, I do what a lot of people do, brought in a management consultant to look at all of our programs. I wanted to know why some people moved out of the shelter quickly while others were stuck in shelter and on the streets. Among the most interesting piece of data we found, among hundreds of data points, one piece stood out. We found out that 18% of the guests in shelter were taking up 53% of the bed nights. A very small group of people were taking up most of our bed nights over the course of a year. That group numbered in the hundreds, and they were staying in shelter, not just for a few weeks or months, but for many, many years. Conversely, 30% of the people coming into shelter left within 2 weeks. Those people used shelter as it was meant to be, a temporary stop until you found something else, housing, a place to stay with family or friends. I was intrigued by the 18%. Why were they stuck? How long had they been in shelter? And why had we not done our job to help end their homelessness? While we were looking at our data, a young sociology professor at Boston College named Dennis Culhane was researching the costs associated with long-term homelessness. His research showed that once long-term homeless people were housed, emergency room and hospital inpatient visits went down, creating a net savings to the public health system. We've duplicated this research in Massachusetts to show that for every long-term homeless person, most of whom have severe disabilities, Mass Health saves between $6,000 and $11,000 per person per year once people are placed in housing with support services. At the very same time, a psychologist in New York City named Sam Timberis was promoting an idea called Housing First. Sam worked at Bellevue Hospital for years and often discharged homeless people back to the streets and to shelter. And when he asked people what they wanted to a person, of course they said they wanted a place to live. Back in Boston, we were aware of both of these innovations, and we had a chance to put together a very small pilot that funded 30 rooms and apartments and some support staff to house people who had been homeless the longest. Some of the shelter staff, and frankly most of the board, thought it was a crazy idea and said it would never work. I pointed out that it was a very small pilot, and if it did not work out, we would make sure people could come back to shelter. Not my preferred option, of course, but we had to start somewhere. We tossed the idea of housing ready out the window and found 30 apartments and room, and we moved people in, no questions asked. We targeted the people who had been homeless the longest. No other criteria at all. The assumptions being that this was an indicator of lots of other things going on in people's lives: substance use, healthcare issues, and mental illness. I'm mortified to tell you that most of these folks had been homeless for well over 10 years, and a handful had been homeless for nearly 20 years. Then we found some staff who thought this was an interesting idea. The early adapters, I would call them, and they came up with a support plan for each tenant. The first year was tough. Calls at all hours of the day and night, everything from the sink is clogged to I lost my medication to one of my favorite calls, I don't know how to work the washing machine. My friend Sam was one of the people we hoped would take a room or an apartment through this pilot. He had been at Pine Street for more than 10 years, came in at 2 a.m. every night and slept on the floor because at 2 a.m. we didn't have any more beds left. When we asked Sam to come in earlier, he said he could not, as there was only one train from Marblehead, and he was in charge of the CIA telescope in Marblehead. As you may know, there are no trains to Marblehead from anywhere, never mind Boston, and I don't think the CIA has a telescope there. Sam suffers from schizophrenia and lives in what I call no man's land. Too sick to live on his own, but not sick enough to be forced into treatment. Sam's only option until Housing First came along was to stay in shelter or stay out on the streets. As part of this pilot, we bought a small apartment building, and one Sunday night I got a call at home from one of the men's in staff saying he had brought Sam over to see the building, which was less than a block away from the shelter. He said he was shocked when Sam said, sure, he would take a look at the building, because Sam had said no to every single offer we had made. When Sam got to a room up on the 4th floor, he turned to the staff person and said, I'll take this one. Staff said, great, okay. Well, try and get you moved in sometime in the next few weeks. No, Sam said, no, tonight. I want to stay here tonight. Knowing our epic failure thus far to get Sam to agree to anything, we decided to let Sam stay and have the shelter staff check in on him through the night. In the morning, staff went over to wake Sam up, knocked on the door, no answer. In a panic, they got the locks off the door, and there was Sam sleeping on the floor, on newspaper, his bags on the bed. We woke Sam up, and he said, I have not had a good night's sleep in 20 years. I can't remember when I've slept this long. I feel safe here. I can lock the door, and I can look out the window and see who's coming into the building. Sam still lives in that house. He's gone from his life in shelter and the streets to eating on a regular basis, taking a shower on a regular basis. We appreciate the small things at Pine Street. Having health care, and having a group of guys he cares about that share the house. After a year, by the way, 82% of the tenants in this pilot were still housed, and we knew we were onto something. We went to the city with the results of the pilot and offered to turn money back for a program that was aimed at people who were homeless for a shorter period of time. Because our data really showed us that those folks were moving out pretty quickly on their own with really a minimal amount of help from us. We added 200 more units of housing over the next few years, and within 3 years, we were able to shut down 2 of our smaller shelters because for the first time in our history, we had empty beds. We had empty beds because we had placed our frequent users in housing, and that freed up a whole lot of capacity in shelter. In fact, more capacity than we needed. We took the money from the shelter closings and put it into more housing. 5 years ago, we passed a milestone. We got to the point where we had more housing units than shelter beds. This strategy has contributed to Boston having one of the lowest street counts in the country. About 2% of the homeless population in the city lives outside. 2% too many, by the way. But if you go to San Francisco or Seattle, close to 50% of the homeless folks in those cities actually stay outside. This past year was like nothing we have seen in our lifetime. The people who showed up, stood up, and put out are the people who got all of us through this pandemic. They had no data, no playbook, but showed up anyways and put themselves on the line. That's the definition of courage. There will be other pandemics, and you will face your own personal pandemics in your lives. You need to exercise your resiliency muscles because that is what will get you through to the other side. I want to make one comment about the divided country we live in at the moment. The people we work for and work with have the most to lose when government does not work. I've worked with many governors, mayors, and elected officials, Democrats, independents, Republicans. This idea that you can repeat a lie over and over again and somehow that becomes the truth is not part of who we are. It was Horace Mann who founded this university who said, "Education is our only political safety." He said that 150 years ago, and it still rings true today. You've spent 4 years here. You need to be part of the generation that will find a way to the other side of this divide and do a better job than my generation has done. I will leave you with two thoughts. I understand the people we work with at Pine Street are not on top of most people's lists. We do not have perfect poor people who show up at our door. Poverty is devastating for those who live with it, and it limits our collective human capacity. We are so worried about people gaming the system that we have lost sight of simple solutions. A few years ago, the Boston Globe profiled a mentally ill homeless man named Michael, who mostly stayed outside. He had been arrested 41 times for trespassing, and most of that were because he broke into buildings on cold nights to find a warm place to stay. When the reporter asked him what he wanted, he said, "I want a place to live. I'd like to have a friend again, and I'd like to find a job." We want all these things, and Michael deserves no less. In the case of Housing First, there are solutions that are more cost-effective than doing nothing. And by the way, why should my friend Mary, who is 74, has schizophrenia and sleeps at South Station, have to figure out the mental health housing and benefits system? Isn't that our job? Needs to be your job, too. Stay curious, ask questions, push on the status quo, and in the words of Nipsey Hussle, try to have more faith and less fear. Thank you and good luck.